When you hang around in pagan circles enough, you're bound to come across a bunch of UPG, or unverified personal gnosis. Personal experiences with the gods that some hold as authoritative in their practices, such as one friend of mine who believes that Dionysos loves wine-soaked gummy bears as offerings, or by another friend that Lilith particularly likes roses. Most are benign until someone insists that their UPG holds authority over others, but some, like the one that I plan on discussing in this video, seem to rapidly become SPG, or shared personal gnosis, with only tentative connections to mythology and folklore. Is this a sign that we should pay attention? Let's take a look. Karate! These last few weeks have been incredibly difficult for me, as old trauma has resurfaced and all kinds of crazy has gone down in my family. One of my partners lost a grandparent, we lost one of the baby rats born last year to cancer, there's been upheaval in jobs and finances that took months to resolve, and in the midst of all of it, PTSD, ADHD, and social anxiety all vied for control of my brain, as is wont to happen under times of stress. After all, mental illness absolutely loves to take advantage of times of stress. It made me feel like I was in a war zone, and it was most of my energy to keep making content week in and week out to make sure that I delivered on my promises to the community. I'm not talking about this to get anyone's pity, mind you. Everyone struggles with mental health things from time to time. Most creators will eventually hit burnout. And you'll probably notice when I'm exhausted because I'll shift to lighter topics like snacks and mythology or gushing about my patron goddess for 15 minutes. I've done a number of videos where I talk about religion, mental health, or both, including one of my more recent ones about pagan imposter syndrome and how mental health can make practice more difficult. Often, Christians and some other traditions will turn to their gods and religious practices for additional comfort and stability in times like this, which I'll caveat you should never do as a replacement for treatment, but absolutely is a valid thing to do in addition to evidence-based treatment if you have access to it. But given the lack of knowledge of mental health in ancient times, Reconstructionists can sometimes feel at a loss about what to do or what god to contact when they're struggling. If you were to post about mental health struggles in a number of Hellenist spaces, you'd eventually come across testimony about Ares helping someone through a tough time, especially around areas like PTSD, whether or not that person was a soldier. And if you respond positively to that comment, you'll also likely get embroiled in the dreaded community SPG argument around this topic, and others like it. Basically, some very uppity Reconstructionist types have decided that despite the sheer prevalence of certain kinds of community SPG, it can't possibly be real because there's no evidence in the lore for it, which is at least partially wrong in this case, but we'll get to that later. Needless to say, this is a bit confusing for me, as I'm not sure how these sorts would have viewed ancient religion had they been born into it. I'm a hard polytheist, not an atheo-pagan, and as such, the following argument comes from the perspective of someone who believes that the gods are real, sentient, disembodied minds with awesome greatness and powers beyond what we humans can currently explain with science. Coming from this perspective, as many of these judgmental types often are, the idea that one can shrink the gods down to only what farmers, aristocrats, and philosophers of the Iron and Bronze Age could comprehend baffles me. Because the ancients didn't create the gods, they responded to them. Much like I argued in my video on whether or not Zeus is a predator, the stories and practices that emerged during these times were the best explanations and conceptualizations of divine experience that these cultures had. And I say cultures plural because ancient Greek city-states varied widely when it came to cult, governance, and even dialects of their very language, let alone the changes that happened to all of them through time and eventual Roman occupation. Our view of the gods is invariably going to be affected by culture, language, and the experiences they choose to share with us. Those we open ourselves to and accept as valid. And these ancient texts effectively amount to ancient SPG on the scale of thousands, because there were thousands of worshippers in a culture that normalized worship and practice. What makes these judgmental folks think that the gods somehow became incapable of interacting with us after this? Or that we as humans are somehow completely incapable of translating our own experiences into valid meaning? The deeper you get into the study of ancient Greece, the more important you find that language and nuance becomes to the things you're studying. The more cultural context and linguistic acumen you have, the more meaning unfurls from the classics and epics. Euthyphro's name is a play on Euthyphron, or right thinking, which becomes a sort of oxymoron as Plato has Socrates tear his seemingly straightforward ideas apart. Knowing that and deep diving on the meaning of the word hosios, or piety, and how it was used, as I did on my video on the topic, opens up new layers of intrigue and meaning in the text that would have been inaccessible otherwise without a good commentary on the translation. Likewise, when studying the relationships between concepts personified by the gods between their various myths, seeing the relationship between wisdom, ingenuity, invention, xenia, weaving, and war regarding Athena, and how all these things were tied together opens up new avenues of worship and appreciation for the great goddess. Inventing the plow, destroying Aias' fleet, helping Odysseus come back home, and tagging Pegasus suddenly become related to one another in your mind, helping you to see more of what we can fathom of who she is. So why would this only apply to ancient texts and experiences if these gods still live and interact with us? Most pagans, after all, will justify their belief, rationally I might add, on some sort of personal experience with the gods. If an experience that is held by many but doesn't seemingly match an ancient text crops up again and again, isn't it time to pay attention? In the case of Ares and mental health, I do actually think there's a compelling, albeit loose case to be made both on ancient texts and in language for a connection. Greek heroes were most often warriors, and also often fell into spells of madness, sometimes divine and sometimes otherwise, which could turn them on friend and foe alike. Ares was the great foot soldier who delighted in blood and conquest, the very manifestation of the destruction of war. Described as hated by even his parents for his bloodthirsty ruthlessness, it's a small wonder the stuff he recons and ha about how dangerous it would be to ask him to help with mental struggles. But consider that madness of this sort, especially given how often it turned on loved ones and friends during peacetime in myth, could very well be equated to PTSD and flashbacks causing irreparable damage. And consider how madness was considered a divine punishment of some kind in ancient times, one that could often only be rectified by returning to arms in service of some leader or another, returning to the very lifestyle the warrior was struggling to adjust away from, to their mind's new normal. If Ares is the quintessential soldier, the greatest of combatants, bloodthirsty and vicious, might he not also understand the aftermath of battle? And perhaps even beyond this, as PTSD afflicts folks who have never done battle with weapons. In fact, Ares was also considered to be a guardian of rioters who were justly fighting their rulers and of those who kept the peace when they were ruling justly. These associations with justice could also easily link him to numerous mental health struggles brought on by unjust actions committed against their victims. In English, mental health struggles are often conceptualized as battles between the soul, or psyche, and the body or mind that has some part malfunctioning. In the case of PTSD or ADHD, it can feel like an actual war between the conscious self and the condition holding you back from your desires. Metaphors like wrestling with demons, fighting a battle with myself, an invading force taking over the body when referencing flashbacks or repetitive anxious thoughts, all lay down the link between the bloodthirsty guardian of peace and the struggle for the mindscape. Beyond this, the sheer level of discipline and determination needed in a war is something comparable with the work one must do to get healthy from everything from addiction to severe depression to anxiety. When getting out of bed feels like facing down a horde, why not ask the greatest warrior to fight by your side? As I mentioned, language and culture influence the parts of the gods we understand and interact with. Our burgeoning scientific understanding of mental health opens up new avenues for us to relate to the gods that in ancient times we might not have considered for help with our struggles. We are reconstructing a new living tradition, carried on by each of us. And as I stated at the beginning, if we see ourselves as interacting with and responding to sentient beings that we're trying to build relationships with, it might do us well to take notice of mass SPG. No one's singular or even shared personal experiences must become authoritative in your practice, of course. Even the ancients could just be a guideline for how you explore these relationships if you so chose, as many eclectics have. But I would urge those who see themselves as Reconstructionists to stop mocking, deriding, and attempting to invalidate community SPG on the grounds of shaky connections to antiquity. Had these religions survived and grown into the modern day, so too would the images of the gods. To believe otherwise is to fossilize these awe-inspiring beings into tiny fractions of their true greatness, and to hobble our own ability to grow and change with them. To me, at least, that's a great tragedy. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, slay the subscribe button and set off the fireworks next to the light. Drop down into the comments and let me know what community SPG you've experienced, and if you've integrated into your practice, or why you haven't if so. Or just tell me that I'm creating a community of fluffy bunnies and that I'm a fraud for not being Greek if that's your speed. Special thanks also to my patrons. With all the recent medical emergencies going on with my pets, your contributions have gone further than ever, making sure that I have the peace of mind and time to keep getting content out week after week, even when the guys can't pick up extra hours and most freelance work has dried up. My cat needed asthma shots and might need them every 3 months for the rest of her life, and this unexpected bill was covered by you all and allowed me to keep working on this script despite the surprise expense instead of scrambling to pick up work to cover it. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.